The wind comes hard across the high ground of southern Georgia, bending dry grasses around black volcanic stone and carrying earth smell from two rivers below. On the ridge above them, the broken walls of a medieval town still resist the weather. Towers rise in fragments. Foundations vanish beneath soil. Paths once crowded with merchants and soldiers now pass through silence. Nothing in the ruined skyline announces that this place contains one of the deepest human stories ever uncovered outside Africa. The oldest inhabitants here left no fortress, no inscription, and no grave. They lived roughly 1.8 million years ago, when the ridge looked nothing like a medieval stronghold and when beings with small brains, modest bodies, and simple stone tools had somehow reached the southern Caucasus. Dmanisi stands near the confluence of the Mashevera and Pinizori rivers, a position that later made strategic sense to people who built walls and controlled roads. Long before those ambitions, the same landscape offered water, stone, patches of woodland, open ground, and routes through a region suspended between continents. Africa lies far to the south, Europe opens to the west and north, Asia stretches eastward. On a modern map, Dmanisi appears like a distant outpost, separated from the early human heartlands of eastern Africa by deserts, uplands, river valleys, and thousands of kilometers. Yet that distance can mislead. No single traveler needed to imagine the whole route. A population can move outward by increments, following game, water, seasonal vegetation, and unfamiliar opportunities. Small movements become hundreds of kilometers over generations. Eventually, descendants stand in a country their ancestors never knew existed. That possibility gives Dmanisi its first and most unsettling power. For much of the 20th century, the earliest expansion beyond Africa seemed likely to require a recognizable package of human advantages: larger brains, taller bodies, advanced hand axes, coordinated hunting, perhaps regular fire. Dmanisi preserves a different answer. The people who reached this ridge carried a technology based mainly on cores, flakes, battered stones, and sharp edges. Their brains range from surprisingly small to merely modest by later human standards. Their bodies were capable of effective upright walking, but they were not simply reduced versions of modern people. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet what survives suggests that the first confirmed travellers into Eurasia did not wait for evolution to finish preparing them. They moved with a mixture of old anatomy and new adaptability. The landscape they entered was not an empty corridor. Open grasslands blended with wooded river margins, scrub, exposed rock, and seasonal water. The climate may have been warmer and drier than Georgia's climate today, but cold seasons still mattered. Winter wind crossed the uplands. Food changed with the year. Shelter could not be assumed. There is no widely accepted evidence that the Dmanisi hominins maintained hearths, cooked their meals, or sat safely around controlled flames. Their survival, therefore, cannot be reduced to the comforting image of fire conquering the cold. They faced a seasonal environment with bodies and behaviours whose limits scholars still debate. They also entered a world crowded with animals powerful enough to make human presence seem temporary. Horses, deer, antelope, rhinoceroses, elephants, and other large herbivores moved through the region. Behind them came an extraordinary community of carnivores: giant hyenas, bears, wolves, ancient hunting dogs, large cats, and saber-toothed predators such as Meganterion and Homotherium. Dmanisi was not a vacant land waiting for people. It was a contested ecology in which carcasses, water, and safe ground attracted multiple species. A sharp stone edge could open hide and remove meat, but it could not make a small hominin the ruler of the food chain. The inhabitants may have hunted some animals, scavenged others, or alternated between both strategies. No single explanation fully accounts for every trace. Even the age of the site resists a simple label. Dmanisi is often compressed into the phrase 1.8 million years ago, as though a single day had been frozen beneath the fortress. In reality, the archaeological sequence spans repeated hominin presence from roughly 1.85 to about 1.77 million years ago. Stone tools appear in multiple layers. Fossils accumulated through processes that may have unfolded across many generations. The 5 famous skulls were not necessarily 5 companions. They were not proven members of one family, and there is no evidence that they died together in a single catastrophe. Their closeness in geological time is extraordinary, but geological closeness is not the same as a shared lifetime. This distinction matters because the human mind instinctively turns faces into characters. 5 skulls invite a group portrait. One seems larger, another more delicate, one younger, one older, and one almost startling in the size of its face compared with the small space that held its brain. It is easy to imagine them walking the same path or gathering at the same shelter. The fossils do not permit that scene. They offer something stranger, several individuals from a local population, or perhaps more than one kind of early human, preserved close enough in time and place to reveal variation that should not have survived so clearly. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. This is not simply about how humans left Africa. It is about how little was apparently required to do so, how much diversity may have travelled with them, and how one ruined hill in Georgia overturned assumptions built from a much thinner record. Above the ancient layers, centuries continued piling up. Settlements rose and fell. Medieval Dmanisi became a fortified town on important trade routes. Churches, walls, streets, storage spaces, and burials covered the ground. The deep past disappeared beneath a more visible past, hidden not in a remote cave but under a place already being excavated. When researchers first worked among the ruins, they were looking mainly at the human history written in stone architecture and medieval debris. The oldest story waited below, mixed with animal bones and crude-looking tools that did not immediately reveal the scale of what they represented. That is the quiet irony of Dmanisi. The site did not announce itself as a gateway in human evolution. It looked like a medieval ruin above 2 rivers. Its oldest occupants had no monumental culture and left no message describing where they came from. Yet beneath the fortress lay evidence that human expansion into Eurasia began earlier, with smaller brains and simpler technology than many scholars had expected. The ridge became a crossroads twice first for ancient hominins moving through a changing world, and much later for caravans and armies whose remains almost concealed them. To reach the 5 faces, the excavation first had to pass through the ruins of people who never knew what slept beneath their feet. The first clues did not look human. Beneath the medieval walls, archaeologists encountered animal bones, volcanic sediments, and chipped stones whose age seemed wildly out of place among churches and fortifications. Dmanisi had long been known as a historic settlement controlling routes through the southern Caucasus. Excavation naturally began with that visible past. The deeper deposits appeared almost as a geological basement beneath the story everyone expected to tell. Yet the farther researchers followed those layers, the more the site separated itself from ordinary medieval archaeology. By the early 1980s, stone artifacts were being recognized in the lower sediments. They were not elegant hand axes or carefully symmetrical tools. Many were flakes, cores, and battered cobbles, objects easily overlooked among natural stone. Their significance came from context. They occurred with extinct animal remains in deposits sealed below the medieval town. The assemblage suggested that an ancient population had struck local stone to create sharp edges, but tools alone could not identify the makers. Early technologies appear across broad regions, and without human fossils, a site can remain an argument rather than a face. The animal bones made the puzzle older and larger. Dmanisi preserved a fauna belonging to the beginning of the Pleistocene horses, deer, bovids, rhinoceroses, elephants, carnivores, and other species from a world long gone. Some helped researchers estimate the age of the sediments before refined geological work strengthened the chronology. The association was startling. If hominins had made the tools, they lived here far earlier than conventional models of settlement in Europe and Western Asia allowed. Still, archaeology advances through caution. A chipped stone may be intentional, but the claim that early humans reached the Caucasus demands evidence capable of surviving scrutiny. That evidence appeared in 1991 as a mandible designated D211. It was not a complete skull emerging cleanly from the earth. It was a lower jaw, compact enough to hold in one hand, but unmistakably hominin. Its teeth and shape linked it to early members of the genus Homo, and its geological position placed a human body within the ancient world already suggested by the tools and fauna. The importance was difficult to exaggerate. A technological trace can be disputed. A human jaw in a well-dated early Pleistocene deposit changes the category of the site. D211 also created new problems. Its anatomy did not fit comfortably into a simple story. Some features resembled early African Homo, while others anticipated forms commonly grouped with Homo erectus. The jaw carried no label from the past. It forced researchers to compare tooth proportions, muscle attachments, and overall form with fossils scattered across Africa and Asia. Scholars still debate how many species those fossils represent, and D211 entered that debate before the remaining faces of Dmanisi had been found. Excavation continued beneath a place where every metre could contain several histories. Medieval construction had altered the ground. Natural cavities, sediment movement, animal activity, and later occupation complicated the lower deposits. Researchers had to establish where each fossil rested, how the sediment formed, and whether nearby objects were truly associated. The work was slower and less cinematic than the final photographs suggest. Sediment was removed carefully, positions were recorded, animal bones were identified, volcanic layers and magnetic signatures were studied. Dmanisi became a problem in geology, taphonomy, and archaeology at once. The most important chronological anchor lay below the fossil-bearing deposits. The Mashavera basalt, produced by an ancient lava flow, reshaped the local terrain around 1.85 million years ago. Sediments accumulated above it. Hominins arrived after the basalt formed, and their tools and remains entered the developing landscape. Later, analyses showed repeated presence rather than one brief occupation. Lower layers preserved artifacts soon after the volcanic episode, while much of the famous fossil material came from younger deposits near 1.8 million years old. This sequence prevents the story from becoming a single frozen camp. Dmanisi was a place returned to, crossed, or used across time. Years passed after D211 before the site revealed how exceptional it was. In 1999, two cranial specimens, D2-82 and D2-82 emerged. They were incomplete compared with later finds, yet they transformed the solitary jaw into evidence of multiple individuals. One cranium was larger and more robust, the other smaller and more lightly built. Their differences were visible, but their meaning was not. They could reflect sex, age, individual variation, or deeper taxonomic separation. The questions that would later dominate Dmanisi were already present. The following year brought another mandible, D2600. Unlike the earlier jaw, it was unusually large and powerful, with massive dimensions and large posterior teeth. Some researchers considered it different enough to justify the species name Homo georgicus. Others hesitated. A single jaw can distort interpretation when the matching face is missing. D2600 remained both evidence and often one of the most remarkable jaws in the early human record. But without the cranium that might explain what head had carried it. In 2001, the site yielded D2700 and its associated mandible, D2735. This individual was not fully mature, and the skull was preserved with completeness rare for such an early date. Its smaller face, delicate construction, and developing dentition added another form to the collection. Dmanisi now seemed to contain not merely several fossils, but a population with different ages and strikingly varied anatomy. That impression intensified when D3444 and the nearly toothless mandible D3900 were recovered in 2002 and 2003. The older individual had survived long after losing most teeth, a fact that would later open one of the most human discussions surrounding the site. Then, in 2005, a cranium designated D4500 appeared. Its brain case was extremely small, but its face was long, broad, and powerfully built. Researchers recognized that it matched D2600 found 5 years earlier. Separate discoveries suddenly became one individual skull 5, the most complete adult skull known from the early Pleistocene when announced. The fit did more than solve an anatomical puzzle. It revealed a combination few expected to see in one head, and forced every earlier fossil from Dmanisi to be reconsidered beside it. The sequence matters because the famous image of 5 skulls creates an illusion of instant revelation. Dmanisi did not surrender a group portrait in one season. It offered fragments over decades, tools without makers, fauna without certainty, one jaw, 2 crania, an unmatched mandible, a younger face, a toothless survivor, and finally the skull that joined a 5-year-old mystery. Each find altered the meaning of those already known. Beneath the fortress, the earliest human story emerged not as a clear answer, but as a steadily expanding contradiction. What had begun as an excavation of a medieval stronghold had become a record of bodies living beyond Africa before the expected anatomy, technology, or behavior seemed to exist, and every newly uncovered bone made the route into Eurasia less simple. Once the separate discoveries were assembled in the laboratory, Dmanisi changed from a site with important fragments into something almost without precedent, a small gallery of early human faces from one place and one narrow span of geological time. The 5 skulls were not identical, not equally complete, and not proven to have belonged to people who knew one another. Yet together they formed a sample more revealing than any isolated cranium could be. Human evolution is usually reconstructed from scattered pieces found hundreds or thousands of kilometers apart. At Dmanisi, several individuals could be compared against the same landscape, the same broad age, and the same archaeological background. Variation that would elsewhere be separated into different species, regions, or eras suddenly stood side by side. Skull 1, centered on specimen D28280, presents a relatively robust adult cranium with a pronounced brow region, and a brain case larger than that of some others at the site. It is incomplete, but enough survives to show a combination of traits familiar from early Homo and later Homo erectus. Skull 2 formed from D2282, and the mandible D211 is smaller and more lightly built. Its proportions differ noticeably from Skull 1. Without the other fossils, those contrasts might have encouraged a tidy division into separate types. Within Dmanisi, they became the beginning of a harder question: how much difference can exist inside one ancient population? Skull 3 D2700 with the mandible D2735 adds age to the variation. This individual had not reached full adulthood. The face is smaller, the bones more delicate, and the dentition preserves evidence of development rather than completed maturity. Because growth changes the skull, comparisons with adults require care. Some features that appear taxonomically important may instead reflect age. That problem is common in paleoanthropology, but Dmanisi makes it visible. The sample includes individuals at different life stages, allowing researchers to ask whether apparent species differences might partly be the shifting architecture of growth. Skull 4 D3444 with D3900 is defined less by size than by survival. Nearly all of the teeth had been lost before death. The jawbone had remodeled, and the empty sockets had healed, showing that tooth loss was not a final injury or damage after burial. The individual lived long enough for the face and jaw to adapt to years without normal chewing. This skull preserves not only anatomy, but biography. It records time passing within one body, and it reminds researchers that fossils are altered by age, disease, wear, and recovery. A skull is not a neutral specimen produced at adulthood. It is the accumulated result of a life. Then comes Skull 5, the union of D4500 and D2600. Its preservation is extraordinary. The small, low brain case holds an estimated volume of about 546 cubic centimeters, while the face is large, projecting, and powerfully constructed. The mandible is deep and massive, with large posterior teeth and heavy areas for muscle attachment. The contrast seems almost exaggerated, a small cranial vault joined to one of the most imposing faces in the Dmanisi sample. Yet the bones belong together. Dental wear, proportions, and anatomical fit link the jaw found in 2000 to the cranium recovered 5 years later. This specimen became famous because it was among the most complete adult skulls known from the early Pleistocene. Completeness matters in ways photographs do not always convey. A fragmented fossil can encourage reconstruction to fill what is absent. Separate jaws and crania can be compared, but uncertain pairing leaves room for imagined combinations. Skull 5 preserves the relationship between brain case, face, palate, teeth, and lower jaw in one individual. It shows that features once treated as belonging to different evolutionary grades can coexist in a single head. The fossil therefore limits the freedom to sort traits into neat categories. The entire Dmanisi collection has similar power. 5 skulls do not create a statistically large population by modern standards, but early human fossils are rarely available in such numbers from one locality. The sample contains a larger adult, a smaller and more graceful adult, an immature individual, an older, nearly toothless individual, and a remarkably robust-faced adult. Their estimated cranial capacities span roughly 546 to 775 cubic centimeters. That range overlaps, forms often placed in Homo habilis, while also including traits associated with Homo erectus. The faces, jaws, brows, teeth, and vault shapes differ enough to make the group visually startling. Their preservation depended on the peculiar history of the ground. The ancient landscape contained natural cavities, pipes, and depressions within volcanic and sedimentary deposits. Bones entered these spaces through several processes. Some animals died nearby. Carnivores carried or disturbed remains. Water and sediment shifted material. Hominin activity added tools and butchered animal bones. Over time, deposits filled and sealed the cavities. The result was not an intact settlement floor but a layered accumulation, a palimpsest in which multiple events overlapped. This complexity makes interpretation difficult, yet it also helped protect fragile cranial remains from destruction. The skulls were concentrated within a relatively limited area, but that does not prove a common death event. There is no secure basis for imagining 5 bodies falling together into a pit, being killed by the same predator or perishing in one disaster. Their remains may have entered the deposits at different times. Geological processes can bring objects from separate episodes into apparent proximity. The faces share a place and a broad period, not necessarily a final moment. Even so, their closeness gives Dmanisi unusual scientific leverage. When fossils from distant sites differ, researchers must consider geography, climate, evolutionary change, and chronology all at once. At Dmanisi, many of those variables are reduced. The individuals lived in the same region and within a comparatively restricted interval. Their differences therefore demand explanation through variation, sex, growth, pathology, body size, or the presence of more than one taxon. None of those possibilities can be dismissed easily. The 5 faces thus emerge not as portraits in a family album but as a controlled challenge to classification. Each carries a distinct history. One is incomplete but robust. One is smaller. One is still growing. One bears the long consequences of tooth loss. One combines a tiny brain case with a huge face and jaw. Together they are more informative than a perfect skull found alone because they reveal the range hidden behind any single specimen. Their survival also allows researchers to see contradiction directly, rather than reconstructing it from casts, measurements, and isolated fragments distributed among distant collections. Dmanisi's uniqueness lies not only in preservation, but in comparison. The site does not offer the comfort of an average early human. It offers variation in concentrated form, forcing the possibility that the first humans beyond Africa were more diverse in body and appearance than the species names built to contain them. The 5 faces become easier to understand when the landscape around them is restored, because Dmanisi was never merely a point on a migration map. It was a living borderland where rivers, volcanic ground, open grass, woodland, and cold seasons met. The ridge above the Mashawera and Pinasuri rivers offered visibility across the surrounding country, but the world below was not a simple plain, it was a patchwork. River margins carried trees and denser vegetation. More open ground supported grazing animals, rocky exposures and old lava-shaped movement. Shrub and woodland broke the wind in some places, while exposed slopes offered little shelter at all. For hominins arriving from regions farther south, this environment was not impossible, but it demanded flexibility. The climate of early Pleistocene Dmanisi was not identical to modern Georgia. Evidence from sediments, fossil animals, and vegetation suggest conditions that were often warmer and drier than those of the region today, yet still strongly seasonal. Summer could open broad feeding grounds. Winter could reduce plant foods, change animal movements, and expose small-bodied hominins to cold they may not have faced in the same way farther south. The point is not that Dmanisi was an icy frontier. It was that this population lived beyond tropical and subtropical settings in a landscape where seasonal stress mattered. Their presence shows that early Homo could tolerate a wider climatic range than older models allowed. That adaptability becomes more striking because there is no widely accepted evidence that they regularly controlled fire. No secure hearths, burned occupation surfaces, or repeated concentrations of charcoal demonstrate that they warmed themselves around maintained flames. Fire may have occurred naturally in the wider landscape. An absence of evidence is not proof that no individual ever encountered or used it. Still, the archaeological record does not support scenes of permanent camps illuminated through freezing nights. Whatever strategies the Dmanisi hominins used, they cannot be safely explained by fire alone. They may have relied on movement, shelter, body heat, seasonal timing, hides or vegetation, and the careful selection of places protected from wind, but the evidence remains incomplete. The rivers were central to this world. They provided water and attracted animals, while also exposing cobbles that could be selected for tool-making. Local stone, including volcanic material, could be struck to produce sharp flakes. A river corridor also functions as a route. Animals follow it, plants concentrate along it, and travellers can move through broken terrain without crossing every ridge. Yet rivers are not guaranteed highways. They flood, narrow, freeze, and lead into difficult country. Dmanisi's position near their confluence offered opportunity because many ecological zones overlapped there, not because the path north had been easy. Large herbivores moved through this mosaic in abundance. Horses occupied open ground. Deer and bovids used grassland, scrub, and wooded margins. Rhinoceroses and elephants added enormous bodies to the landscape, while smaller mammals filled the spaces between. Their presence meant meat, marrow, hides, and bone, but only when hominins gained access. A dead animal could become a temporary centre of competition. The scent carried far. Hyenas, wolves, large cats, and scavenging birds could arrive quickly. Stone flakes gave hominins a way to cut skin and remove tissue, but a tool did not guarantee ownership. Timing, numbers, alertness, and retreat mattered as much as sharpness. Dmanisi has often been described as a kind of carnivore paradise, and the phrase is justified by the extraordinary variety of predators preserved there. The giant hyena Pachyrhacota was larger and more heavily built than living spotted hyenas. Saber-toothed cats such as Meganterion and Homotherium occupied different predatory niches. Bears, wolves, leopards or leopard-like cats, and ancient canids added further pressure. These animals did not all hunt in the same way, and they were not constantly attacking hominins. They competed with one another as well, but their combined presence means that every carcass, water source, and sheltered passage belonged to a network of danger. For early humans, survival in such a system may have depended less on domination than on reading the landscape. They needed to notice tracks, smell decay, interpret alarm calls, and recognize when a predator had recently fed. They may have exploited brief intervals after a kill was abandoned or before larger scavengers arrived. They may also have processed animals acquired through hunting, but cut marks alone cannot separate every pathway. What survives in the record suggests skilled use of animal resources, not mastery over the ecosystem. Plant foods were probably equally important, though they preserved poorly. Tubers, seeds, nuts, fruits, leaves, and edible shoots could have supplied energy across different seasons. Riverine woodland and open scrub would not have offered the same foods throughout the year. A flexible diet may have been one of the most important adaptations carried beyond Africa. If one resource declined, another could partly replace it. This kind of ecological versatility leaves fewer dramatic traces than a spear or hearth, yet it may explain movement better than any single invention. The surrounding geology also shaped preservation. Volcanic activity had laid down basalt before the main fossil-bearing sediments accumulated. Later, cracks, pipes, cavities, and depressions formed traps where bones and sediment collected. Animals entered these spaces in different ways. Some remains were carried by predators. Some may have fallen or washed in. Hominin bones joined a mixed record of life, death, movement, and disturbance. The landscape that supported occupation also created the conditions under which a handful of individuals could survive as fossils. This was therefore neither Africa repeated nor Europe fully formed. Dmanisi stood in an ecological middle ground, connected to Western Asia and open toward the Caucasus. Its inhabitants encountered familiar needs in unfamiliar combinations: water, food, shelter, rivals, cold, and distance. They did not need to conquer the whole region at once. They only needed to remain alive long enough for populations to persist, disperse, and return. Even migration itself may have followed these seasonal rhythms, with groups expanding during favorable periods and withdrawing when resources thinned. Such movement would leave no clear frontier, only repeated pulses of presence across a changing landscape. The deeper surprise is that their success may have depended on behavioral flexibility rather than specialized equipment. Their tools were effective but technologically modest. Their brains were small. Their bodies retained primitive features. Yet they occupied a seasonal landscape crowded with dangerous carnivores and large herbivores. No single explanation fully accounts for how they managed it. Perhaps mobility mattered most. Perhaps cooperation reduced risk. Perhaps broad diets and close attention to local conditions allowed them to survive where a more specialized population would fail. Dmanisi preserves no manual of adaptation. It preserves the result early humans had crossed into a world between continents and had remained there long enough to leave tools, bones, and 5 radically different faces beneath the ground. The farther the Dmanisi hominins move from Africa, the more tempting it becomes to enlarge them. Distance seems to demand a larger brain, a taller body, better weapons, and a deliberate plan. Yet the fossils resist that transformation. Their cranial capacities range from about 546 to 775 cubic centimeters, placing them below most later Homo erectus, and overlapping some fossils commonly assigned to Homo habilis. Skull 5 sits at the lower extreme, with a brain case only modestly larger than those of much earlier hominins. Even the largest Dmanisi cranium remains far smaller than that of a modern human. These were not travelers equipped with the anatomy expected for the first expansion into Eurasia. Brain size alone, however, does not reveal a mind. A small brain is not a direct measurement of poor judgment, weak memory, or limited social behavior. Neural organization matters, as do body size, sensory demands, development, and learned experience. Study of the internal surfaces of early Homo skulls suggests that the Dmanisi brains retained aspects of frontal organization more primitive than those of later humans. This implies the dispersal beyond Africa began before a fully modern pattern of brain structure evolved. It does not imply that the inhabitants were incapable of planning across a familiar landscape, recognizing stone, sharing information, or responding flexibly to danger. Fossil endocus preserve contours, not thoughts. The old expectation of a brain first, migration later sequence grew partly from the record available before Dmanisi. Later Homo erectus fossils from Africa and Asia often show larger bodies, larger brains, and more human-like proportions than earlier Homo. Achillean hand axes appeared to mark a technological advance, and the spread of such humans seemed naturally connected with their improved equipment. Dmanisi disrupted the sequence by showing that movement occurred without this full package. Its inhabitants used Mode 1 tools. There is no accepted evidence for a regular Achillean hand axe tradition at the site. There is no secure evidence that controlled fire made the winters manageable. Their success cannot be explained by projecting later Homo erectus abilities backward. Their bodies add another layer to the contradiction. More than 100 postcranial remains have been recovered, though they cannot all be assigned confidently to the 5 skulls. The legs indicate efficient habitual bipedalism. The hip, knee, ankle, and foot were capable of supporting sustained upright walking. The big toe was aligned with the others rather than diverging for grasping, and the foot likely possessed a longitudinal arch. Lower limbs were relatively long, providing a stride suited to movement across open ground. These features made long-distance travel possible mechanically, but the rest of the skeleton was not fully modern. The arms were relatively long. The shoulders and upper body retained a combination of traits unlike those of Homo sapiens. Some vertebral and limb proportions suggest a body built from inherited and newly derived features. The Dmanisi hominins were competent walkers, but not miniature modern people wearing ancient faces. Their anatomy was a mosaic, and the mosaic itself travelled. Migration does not require every feature to reach an ideal form. It requires enough combined capacity to move, obtain food, reproduce, and survive. Body size also varied. Estimates derived from different limb bones often place individuals around 145 to 166 centimeters in height and roughly 40 to 50 kilograms in mass. But those numbers depend on specimen and method. The bones do not form 5 complete labelled skeletons beneath 5 complete heads. It is impossible to assign each face a precise stature. At least some inhabitants were relatively small, and the population was probably not uniform. A smaller body reduces absolute energy needs, though it may also lose heat more quickly and offer less protection against predators. Adaptation involves trade-offs rather than simple improvement. How, then, did such hominins reach the Caucasus? The answer may lie in abandoning the image of one heroic departure. They did not need to understand continents, latitude, or the distance from eastern Africa to Georgia. No map existed in their minds. A local range could widen by a few kilometers when water shifted. Prey moved, or neighboring groups occupied nearby territory. Descendants could repeat the process. Over many generations, a chain of ordinary movements becomes an extraordinary geographic expansion. The individuals at Dmanisi may have been born far from Africa after their ancestors had already spent generations across Western Asia. Movement could also occur in pulses rather than as a steady advance. Climate-altered vegetation and animal communities. Grasslands expanded, woodland corridors changed, and river systems opened or closed routes. Hominin populations may have moved outward during favourable periods, contracted during harsher intervals, and expanded again. A network of groups could have stretched across the Levant and Western Asia, without any one group completing the entire journey. The evidence remains incomplete because sites between Africa and Georgia are sparse, unevenly preserved, and difficult to date. Dmanisi is the clearest early body fossil evidence outside Africa, but it may not record the first departure. Stone tools from Shangcheng in China have been dated to about 2.12 million years ago, though no hominin fossils accompanied them. Cut-marked bones from Grunceanu in Romania have been argued to approach 1.95 million years in age. Such finds suggest that hominins may have dispersed earlier and farther than Dmanisi alone demonstrates. Their interpretation remains debated, and they make the Georgian fossils part of a larger, poorly illuminated movement. The surprising detail is not merely that small-brained hominins travelled. It is that traits once treated as prerequisites may have been consequences of later evolution, rather than tickets required at the beginning. Large brains, Acheulean hand axes, controlled fire, and fully modern body proportions may have improved survival. But Dmanisi shows they were not all necessary for the earliest confirmed expansion into Eurasia. Ecological flexibility, social learning, mobility, and the ability to exploit unfamiliar opportunities may have mattered more. Nothing about this makes the journey easy. Small groups faced seasonal cold, predators, uncertain food, and unfamiliar terrain. Many expansions probably failed. Populations may have vanished without leaving descendants or fossils. The people preserved at Dmanisi are not evidence of effortless conquest. They are evidence that some early humans could survive beyond the environments in which their lineage had evolved. Their bodies carried ancient limitations, but also capacities whose importance had been underestimated. That is why their small brain cases remain so provocative. They force a separation between the anatomy we associate with ourselves and the behavioral threshold required to enter a new continent. The first confirmed Eurasian pioneers did not resemble the triumphant end point of human evolution. They were lightly equipped, physically varied, and neurologically ancient. Yet they crossed ecological boundaries that no earlier hominin population has left such clear evidence of crossing. Their achievement was not the result of becoming modern. It was the result of being adaptable enough before modernity existed. Adaptability explains how early humans could reach Dmanisi, but it does not explain why the people found there look so different from one another. Once the 5 skulls are placed together, the variation becomes impossible to ignore. One has a relatively larger brain case and stronger brow. Another is smaller and more lightly built. A younger individual preserves a different balance between face and vault, because growth was still unfinished. The nearly toothless skull carries the effects of age and long-term dental loss. Skull 5 combines the smallest brain case in the group with the largest face and most massive jaw. If these fossils had been discovered at widely separated sites, some might easily have received different species names. That possibility lies at the center of the Dmanisi debate. Paleoanthropology depends on classification, yet classification is especially difficult when the sample is small and scattered across time. A single jaw from one region may be compared with a partial cranium from another, and differences can be interpreted as evidence of separate species. Later discoveries sometimes reveal that traits once treated as distinct can occur together in one individual. Skull 5 provided exactly that kind of warning. Its huge face and jaw would have seemed difficult to pair with such a small cranial vault if the pieces had remained separate. Because D4500 and D2600 fit together, the fossil shows that early Homo could combine features that conventional categories tended to separate. The Dmanisi research team has argued that all 5 skulls belong to one local population, usually placed within Homo erectus in a broad sense. Under this interpretation, The differences reflect the kinds of variation that can occur inside a species' sex, age, body size, individual development, disease, tooth loss, and inherited diversity. Modern human populations contain variation, and living apes can differ in skull size and robustness between individuals. Fossil samples often hide such range because only one or two specimens survive from each place. Dmanisi, by preserving several faces together, may reveal a variability that was always present but rarely visible. If that interpretation is correct, its consequences extend far beyond Georgia. Early African fossils have been divided among names such as Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo ergaster, partly because their skulls and jaws differ. The Dmanisi sample raises the possibility that at least some of those distinctions exaggerate normal variation within a broader, evolving lineage. A population can include small and large individuals, robust and graceful faces, different dental proportions, and bodies at different stages of growth. A taxonomy built from isolated fossils may split one variable lineage into several species simply because the connecting population has not been found. This argument is powerful, but it is not universally accepted. Critics note that the differences at Dmanisi are not limited to overall size. The shape of the mandibles, the proportions of the teeth, the architecture of the face, and details of the cranial vault may form patterns too large or too structured to be explained by sex and age alone. D2600, the jaw associated with skull 5, is especially unusual. Its size and morphology differ sharply from the more lightly built mandibles at the site. Some researchers have therefore suggested that Dmanisi may preserve more than one species, perhaps two related populations occupying the region within the same interval. The problem becomes circular. To decide whether large differences reflect two species, researchers need to know how much variation one species of early Homo could contain. Yet Dmanisi is one of the main samples used to estimate that variation. If all 5 skulls are assumed to belong to one species, the acceptable range becomes very broad. If the most unusual specimens are assigned to another species, the range narrows. The fossils cannot announce which starting assumption is correct. Sexual dimorphism offers one possible explanation, but the sex of the skulls is not securely known. Robust individuals are often described informally as male and gracile ones as female, yet that reasoning risks using size to prove its assumption. No ancient DNA identifies biological sex, and the skulls are not paired with complete pelvises. Age can be estimated more confidently from tooth eruption, wear, and bone change, but even age interacts with health and development. The labels commonly attached to the faces are therefore useful shorthand, not verified biographies. Growth adds further complexity. Skull 3 belonged to an individual who had not finished maturing, and recent microscopic study of its teeth suggests a developmental pattern unlike either living apes or modern humans. Dental tissues formed quickly, but some rear teeth were delayed, and later growth showed a more human-like extension. This mosaic childhood means that adult proportions cannot simply be projected backward onto the younger skull. Features that appear distinctive may partly reflect an evolutionary growth schedule still in transition. Pathology also reshapes anatomy. The toothless individual experienced major remodeling of the jaws. Skull 5 shows changes around the face that may relate to injury, disease, or chronic stress. Teeth wear down. Chewing muscles alter bone through repeated force. A fossilized skull is the outcome of genes, growth, diet, trauma, aging, and daily use. When only a handful of individuals survive, an unusual life history can be mistaken for a population-wide trait. A 2025 study of 24 Dmanisi teeth revived the multiple species hypothesis by identifying two clusters of crown dimensions that the authors argued were difficult to explain through sexual dimorphism alone. They linked one group more closely with Homo erectus or related early Homo and interpreted the other as more primitive, reviving Homo georgicus and proposing the name Homo caucasi. Teeth preserve measurable patterns and often survive when other bones do not, yet the sample remains small. Not every tooth can be paired securely with a particular skull, and crown size can vary for several reasons. The proposal has not produced a new consensus, so the 5 faces continue to support 2 incompatible readings. They may show one extraordinarily variable population, warning that scientists have named too many early human species from isolated fragments, or they may preserve more than one lineage, warning that apparent variation is being used to merge genuinely distinct forms. No single explanation fully accounts for every anatomical contrast. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Dmanisi provides more complete evidence than most early human sites and still refuses to settle the question of identity. The fossils expose the limits of species boundaries drawn across deep time, where reproduction cannot be observed and genes has not survived. 5 faces stand together in the earth, but whether they represent one human form or several remains unresolved. Their diversity does not clarify the family tree. It reveals how much of that tree may have been shaped by the accidents of preservation and the human desire to give every branch a name. The problem of variation leads directly to the problem of names. Early human fossils do not arrive with species labels, and the labels applied to them are not merely descriptive. Each name implies a relationship, a boundary, and a place in a family tree that becomes less tree-like the closer one looks. At Dmanisi, the same bones have been called Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, Homo georgicus, and early Homo without further commitment. None of these terms is meaningless. Each emphasizes a different way of organizing the evidence, and each carries assumptions that the fossils cannot fully confirm. Homo erectus is the broadest and most familiar possibility. In its widest use, the name includes early human populations spread across Africa and Eurasia for an immense span of time. Fossils assigned to it appear in Eastern Africa, the Caucasus, China, and Indonesia, with substantial differences in brain size, skull shape, teeth, and body proportions. Under this broad definition, the Dmanisi hominins represent an early and unusually primitive regional population of Homo erectus, close to the beginning of a long expansion. Their small brains and mixed anatomy are not disqualifying. They simply show what the lineage looked like before later populations developed the more familiar form seen in parts of Asia. Yet Homo erectus itself is not one uncontested biological unit. Some researchers reserve the name mainly for Asian fossils and use Homo ergaster for earlier African forms with somewhat different cranial anatomy. In that scheme, Dmanisi may lie near the boundary between the two, combining features associated with African Homo ergaster and traits that anticipate Asian Homo erectus. Other scholars reject the separation, arguing that the differences reflect geography and time within one widely distributed species. The disagreement is not about one dramatic feature. It concerns how much regional variation a long-lived lineage can contain before a new species name becomes useful. Dmanisi makes that question especially difficult because of its age. At roughly 1.8 million years, the population appears near the beginning of the better documented Eurasian record. It is early enough to retain similarities with Homo habilis and other African Homo, yet geographically positioned outside Africa, where later Homo erectus populations become prominent. The fossils can therefore be interpreted as transitional without being an orderly intermediate. Evolution rarely produces a clean staircase. A population can preserve old traits, develop new ones, and vary internally at the same time. The name Homo georgicus emerged from that ambiguity. It was proposed after the discovery of the exceptionally large mandible D2600 and other Dmanisi remains. The jaw appeared sufficiently distinctive to some researchers to justify a separate species rooted in Georgia. It was deep, robust, and unlike the smaller mandibles from the same site. When the matching cranium D4500 was found, and the two pieces became skull 5, the unusual anatomy grew even more striking. The face was enormous relative to the brain case, and the complete combination seemed to strengthen the case that something taxonomically unusual had been preserved. The Dmanisi team eventually moved away from treating Homo georgicus as a clearly separate species and favoured inclusion within Homo erectus in a broad sense. Some formulations became deliberately layered, such as Homo erectus agaster georgicus, a name that tries to acknowledge both regional distinctiveness and connection to a wider lineage. Such compound terminology can sound precise, but it often records uncertainty rather than resolving it. The safer phrase, and often the most scientifically honest one, is simply the Dmanisi hominins. That restraint matters because species in the fossil record cannot be tested in the same way as living populations. There is no possibility of observing whether two groups interbred, recognized mates, or produced fertile descendants. Ancient DNA has not survived from Dmanisi, and no hominin proteome has yet settled the issue. Researchers must rely on anatomy, measurements, growth patterns, and comparisons with other fossils. Those methods are essential, but they are indirect. They can identify clusters and contrasts without always revealing whether those contrasts represent species, populations, sex, age, or individual history. Even the meaning of a species boundary changes depending on the evolutionary model being used. A lineage that spreads across continents may remain connected by occasional gene flow while developing strong regional differences. Another lineage may split into partly isolated populations that later reconnect. In such cases, neat categories imposed millions of years later may not match the biological reality experienced by the populations themselves. Dmanisi could represent one branch, a meeting zone, a peripheral population, or an early expansion that left no direct descendants. The evidence does not force a single answer. The 2025 dental study sharpened the dispute by proposing that the teeth fall into two morphological groups. If correct, that pattern may indicate that more than one taxon occupied the region. One group could belong near Homo erectus, while another retained more primitive dental characteristics. The authors revived Homo georgicus and proposed Homo caucasi for part of the sample. Yet the conclusion remains provisional. 24 teeth form a valuable but limited data set. Some cannot be linked securely to particular skulls, and tooth dimensions can vary with sex, body size, development, and ancestry. The study reopens the case, it does not close it. There's also a deeper danger in naming too quickly. A new species can make a complex fossil record appear clearer than it is. Once a label enters textbooks, reconstructions, and museum displays, it begins to feel like a discovered entity rather than a hypothesis. Conversely, merging too many fossils into Homo erectus can flatten real diversity and hide evolutionary experiments that deserve recognition. Both splitting and lumping can mislead. Dmanisi sits precisely where those errors become visible. What survives in the record suggests that early Homo was neither uniform nor easily partitioned. The 5 skulls may belong to one highly variable population. They may include 2 populations living near the same rivers. They may represent a local branch related to, but not identical with, the ancestors of later Asian Homo erectus. Scholars still debate every one of these possibilities because the fossils support parts of each and decisively exclude none. The uncertainty survives because classification is a tool built by observers, while evolution unfolded as populations, bodies, and relationships changing continuously through time. The identity problem, therefore, cannot be solved by selecting the most impressive skull and naming the group after it. Skull 5 is too unusual to stand as the average face of Dmanisi, while the smaller skulls cannot erase its presence. The collection must be held together even when its internal differences strain the categories built around it. That tension is what makes the site scientifically valuable. Dmanisi does not merely add a species to the human story. It questions whether the species boxes used for early Homo are capable of containing the biological variation that actually existed. Names define how researchers arrange the fossils, but daily survival depended on things far more immediate: stone that fractured predictably, animals that could be opened before competitors arrived, plants that changed with the season, and enough cooperation to keep vulnerable individuals alive in a landscape crowded with teeth. Dmanisi preserves no huts, baskets, clothing, or wooden tools. Almost everything soft has vanished. Wooden digging sticks or clubs may also have existed, but the site does not preserve them securely enough to describe. What remains is a harder archive of flakes, cores, broken bones, tooth marks, and the bodies of the hominins themselves. From these fragments, a way of life can be approached, but never watched directly. Thousands of stone artifacts show that the inhabitants did not merely pick up naturally sharp rocks. They selected local material, including cobbles available near river channels and volcanic sources, and struck them in controlled sequences. The technology belongs mainly to Mode 1, often described as Oldowan-like. Cores were reduced to detach useful flakes. Some cobbles were battered into chopping tools. Hammerstones and debris show that tool production occurred at the site rather than only elsewhere. The results lack the standardized symmetry of later Acheulean hand axes, but simplicity of form does not mean absence of skill. A useful flake requires knowledge of angle, force, stone quality, and the direction in which a fracture will travel. Such tools were temporary solutions rather than treasured masterpieces. A flake could cut skin, separate muscle, slice tendons, or scrape tissue from bone. Its edge dulled quickly, but another could be made from a nearby cobble. This strategy suited mobile groups in a landscape where raw material was locally available. Instead of carrying elaborate tools over long distances, the Dmanisi hominins may have carried knowledge where stone could be found, which pieces would break cleanly, and how to produce an edge when one was needed. That invisible knowledge was more durable than any individual artifact. Animal bones bearing cut marks and percussion damage show that sharp edges were applied to carcasses. Hominins removed flesh, disarticulated some joints, and sometimes struck bones to reach marrow. These traces demonstrate access to meat and fat, but they do not reveal how the animals died. A horse or antelope could have been hunted, discovered after natural death, taken from a predator's abandoned kill, or contested during a brief interval between carnivore visits. The same cut mark can fit several stories. Scholars still debate how often early Homo hunted actively and how often it scavenged, because the archaeological record preserves processing more clearly than acquisition. The distinction may also be too rigid. A flexible population could hunt small or vulnerable animals when opportunities appeared, scavenge large carcasses when predators withdrew, collect naturally dead animals, and exploit marrow after most flesh was gone. Survival in a carnivore-rich ecosystem rewarded opportunism. Refusing a carcass because it had not been killed personally would have been an evolutionary luxury. The Dmanisi hominins needed calories, not categories. Their competitors were formidable. Giant hyenas could crush bones that humans struggled to break. Saber-toothed cats brought down large prey. Wolves, ancient hunting dogs, bears, and leopard-like cats moved through the same mosaic of grassland and woodland. Some carnivores transported bones, chewed carcasses, and reused parts of the site. Tooth marks on animal remains and the mixed nature of the deposits reveal overlapping activity rather than a territory controlled by humans. At times, hominins may have arrived first. At others, they may have approached only after larger predators fed. Retreat was probably as important as boldness. This setting changes the meaning of cooperation. Group living was not necessarily a moral achievement in the modern sense. It was a practical defense. Several alert individuals could watch different directions while others cut meat. Numbers could discourage some competitors, though not every large predator. Shared vigilance reduced the chance of surprise. Knowledge of escape routes, climbable terrain, narrow passages, and protected resting places could be transmitted through repeated experience. None of this requires language as complex as ours, and there is no direct evidence for such language at Dmanisi. Coordinated behavior can grow from gesture, calls, imitation, and familiarity. Food sharing is plausible but difficult to prove. A carcass processed with stone tools creates portions that can be carried or consumed by several individuals. Marrow can be extracted and passed. Tough meat can be cut into smaller pieces. Yet bones do not record who received what, whether access followed rank, kinship, tolerance, or immediate need. The evidence remains incomplete. What survives suggests that solitary foraging would have been risky and inefficient, but it cannot reconstruct the rules of the group. Meat was only part of the diet. Plant foods rarely preserve at open sites, creating an illusion that stone and bone tell the whole nutritional story. River margins, scrub, and woodland could provide fruits, seeds, nuts, leaves, roots, tubers, and seasonal shoots. Some foods could be eaten directly. Others may have been pounded, peeled, or cut. Without secure residues or preserved plant remains, the proportions remain unknown. Dental wear indicates repeated exposure to varied textures and abrasive particles, but it cannot produce a daily menu. The absence of confirmed fire matters here. Raw meat is harder to chew and digest than cooked meat, and many underground plant foods become safer or more nutritious after heating. There is no widely accepted evidence that Dmanisi hominins cooked routinely. Their teeth, jaws, and digestive behavior therefore operated within a food economy different from that of later fire-dependent humans. Cutting meat into smaller portions, selecting soft tissues, eating marrow, and mechanically processing plants could partly compensate. Skull Five's massive chewing apparatus may reflect demanding use, but one robust individual cannot define the diet of everyone at the site. Teeth preserve daily strain with unusual intimacy. They erupt according to developmental schedules, accumulate wear, chip, become diseased, and sometimes disappear long before death. Differences among the Dmanisi dentitions reflect age, diet, body size, and possibly ancestry. The younger individual shows growth still underway. Adults show heavy use. The oldest face reveals an extreme outcome of dental loss, but its deeper implications belong to a separate and more difficult question. For now, the stone and animal remains show a population neither helpless nor dominant. These hominins could recognize useful rock, manufacture edges, process carcasses, break bones, and navigate a dangerous food web. They probably combined meat, marrow, and plant resources as conditions changed. They may have coordinated around carcasses and shared some foods, but no single explanation fully accounts for the social details. Their technology was modest, yet it was portable because the essential tool was not the stone itself. It was the learned ability to turn an ordinary cobble into immediate access to food, and to do so before the other teeth in the landscape arrived. The nearly toothless face at Dmanisi draws attention for a different reason than Skull 5. It is not the largest, the strangest, or the most complete. Its power comes from endurance. The cranium D34444 and mandible D3900 belong to an older individual who had lost every tooth long before death. The empty tooth sockets were not fresh gaps. The surrounding bone had resorbed and remodeled, showing that the losses occurred during life and that the jaw had adapted over time. This individual did not survive for days without normal teeth, but likely for years. That fact seems simple until the consequences are considered. Teeth cut, crush, and grind food before it reaches the stomach. Losing them changes what can be eaten, how long chewing takes, and how much energy a meal provides. Tough meat becomes difficult. Fibrous plants resist the gums. Hard seeds, nuts, and raw roots become less accessible. In an environment without metal knives, cooking vessels, dental treatment, or confirmed routine fire, near total tooth loss could have been a severe disadvantage. Yet this individual lived long enough for the body to record prolonged adaptation. The most appealing explanation is social assistance. Other hominins may have shared softer foods, cut flesh into manageable pieces, crushed plant material, or provided marrow and other high-energy tissues that required little chewing. A flake could reduce meat to small strips. Bones could be broken so that soft fat was available. Naturally tender organs, ripe fruits, and certain plant foods could be consumed with the gums. If companions tolerated the older individual near carcasses or brought food back, survival would have become easier. This possibility is often described as evidence of compassion, and it may indeed preserve an early form of care. But the fossil cannot reveal motive. It does not show one individual feeding another, nor does it identify kinship, obligation, affection, or status. The toothless hominin may have contributed knowledge, vigilance, social familiarity, or other benefits that left no physical trace. Assistance could have been regular, occasional, or simply the result of group access to food. Survival consistent with care is not identical to proof of a moral system like our own. Self-reliance also cannot be excluded. Many foods in the Dmanisi landscape would have been soft, or could have been swallowed after limited processing. Marrow requires access to a broken bone but little chewing. Brains and other soft tissues are energy-rich. Ripe fruit, tender leaves, eggs, and some underground foods may be manageable without teeth. The individual could have used stone tools, held food in the hands, cut it into small pieces, and relied on the tongue and gums. Toothless people in human populations sometimes adapt remarkably well. especially when diets and food preparation permit it. The ancient case may combine personal adjustment with social support rather than demanding only one explanation. Even so, complete independence in this setting would have been difficult. Dmanisi was crowded with carnivores, and access to carcasses could be brief. An older individual with altered chewing ability may also have experienced other effects of age, though the bones do not allow a full medical reconstruction. Remaining close to others would reduce risk. If food was processed collectively, the extra cost of allowing one more group member to eat may have been small. Cooperation need not begin as charity. It can emerge from tolerance, repeated association, shared defense, and the benefits of group living. This specimen also complicates the meaning of age in early Homo. D344 is often called an old man in popular accounts, but sex is not securely known. Older individual is more accurate. The fossil was old relative to the Dmanisi sample because of dental loss and cranial changes, yet its exact age in years cannot be determined confidently. Early Homo may have matured faster than modern humans, and life expectancy statistics derived from later populations cannot simply be applied. The face records advanced wear and survival, not a modern retirement age. Its condition may have developed through severe dental disease, heavy wear, trauma, or a combination of causes. Abrasive particles in food can grind enamel. Repeated use of teeth for processing materials can increase stress, though such behavior is not demonstrated specifically here. Infection may loosen teeth. Once teeth are lost, the jaw no longer receives the same mechanical loading, and bone gradually recedes. That remodeling is the crucial clock. It proves time passed after the losses and rules out the idea that the teeth disappeared only through excavation damage or after death. The Dmanisi skulls are often used to discuss species, but this individual shows why biology cannot be separated from biography. A jaw altered by years without teeth may look unlike the jaw of a healthy adult from the same population. Age and pathology can exaggerate anatomical difference. When fossil samples are small, one unusual life can influence how an entire species is described. D344 and D3900 therefore matter both socially and taxonomically. They preserve possible care, while warning that variation has causes beyond ancestry. There is another implication. If the individual survived through assistance, then social dependence was present among hominins with small brains and Mode 1 technology. Complex tools were not required for meaningful support, nor would advanced language necessarily be required. Repeated proximity, food tolerance, gesture, and recognition could sustain an impaired group member. This does not make the Dmanisi population modern. It shows that social resilience may be much older than the anatomical features usually associated with modern humanity. The record remains frustratingly silent about the daily scene. No preserved sleeping place can be assigned to this individual. No tool is known to have belonged to those hands. No food portion remains beside the jaw as evidence of deliberate provision. The skull does not tell whether help came from one companion or many, whether it lasted every day, or whether the individual sometimes went hungry. Every reconstruction must stop before certainty turns into invention. Yet the survival itself is real. Bone remodeling cannot be explained away by sentimentality. A nearly toothless hominin remained alive in a seasonal, predator-rich environment for a substantial period. Somehow, calories continued to reach the body. The solution may have included soft foods, stone-assisted processing, personal adaptation, and social support in proportions that can no longer be measured. Among the 5 faces, this one provides the quietest challenge. Skull 5 confronts taxonomy with dramatic anatomy. The toothless individual confronts assumptions about what small-brained early humans could sustain socially. The fossil does not prove compassion in the modern sense, but it makes complete indifference harder to imagine. At minimum, the Dmanisi hominins lived in a social world flexible enough that severe dental loss did not immediately end one life. In a landscape where predators competed for every carcass and winter narrowed every menu, continued survival may itself be the strongest surviving trace of care. The survival of the toothless individual suggests that the Dmanisi hominins possessed one resource more important than any single tool: flexibility. That same quality helps explain how populations with small brains and modest technology could move beyond Africa. Early dispersal was often imagined as the reward for reaching a higher evolutionary level. First came larger bodies, longer legs, more sophisticated brains, hand axes, organized hunting, perhaps fire. Only then did humans become capable of entering Eurasia. Dmanisi reverses the sequence. The movement came before the complete package. Expansion was not the final achievement of a fully developed Homo erectus. It was something earlier, smaller, and more anatomically mixed populations could already accomplish. The stone assemblage makes this clear. The inhabitants did not arrive with the large, carefully shaped bifaces associated with Acheulean technology. Their tools were mainly flakes, cores, choppers, and hammerstones produced through Mode 1 reduction. They required no standardized form carried across continents. A suitable cobble could be struck, used, and discarded. Because raw material was available near rivers and volcanic exposures, a group did not need to transport a heavy toolkit over great distances. The technology traveled as learned behavior rather than finished equipment. This distinction matters. A hand axe can survive archaeologically and appear impressive in a museum, while knowledge leaves no direct fossil. Knowing where to find nappable stone, how to detach a sharp flake, when to abandon a poor core, and which edge could open hide represented a durable behavioral system. It was simple compared with later technologies, but not random. The tools reveal planning at the scale needed for immediate tasks. Not a technological revolution designed for migration. No one needed to invent a special Eurasian toolkit before crossing an invisible continental boundary. The absence of confirmed fire strengthens the same lesson. Fire would have offered warmth, protection, light, and cooked food. Yet no secure hearth tradition has been demonstrated at Dmanisi. The hominins may occasionally have encountered natural fire, and evidence can disappear, so absolute claims would be unwise. Still, the record does not allow controlled fire to serve as the essential engine of their expansion. They reached a seasonal Caucasian environment without leaving proof of a behavior once treated as indispensable beyond warm Africa. Their anatomy also undermines the idea that dispersal required a completely modern body. The legs and feet were well suited to upright walking, but the shoulders, arms, and torso retained more primitive proportions. Some individuals were relatively small. Their brains were far below modern size, and internal cranial organization appears to have remained archaic in important respects. Yet locomotion does not demand perfection. A body capable of efficient daily walking, combined with a flexible diet and repeated local movements, can spread a population over enormous distances without producing a single dramatic journey. The process may have been almost invisible from one generation to the next. A group follows grazing animals into a neighboring valley. Another tracks water through a dry season. Population growth pushes some individuals toward less crowded ground. Vegetation shifts, opening grassland where woodland had stood. Descendants occupy a river basin slightly farther north or east. Over centuries, those small expansions accumulate. Out of Africa describes the result from a modern map. It does not describe the intention of the people moving. This model also allows for retreat and failure. Early Homo populations may have expanded into Western Asia repeatedly, disappeared from some regions, and returned when conditions changed. Dmanisi need not record one successful wave that founded every later Eurasian population. It may represent one branch among several, perhaps a population that persisted for a time and then vanished without direct descendants. The evidence remains incomplete between Eastern Africa, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Caucasus. Archaeology preserves isolated windows, not a continuous trail of camps. Other early finds make the picture even less linear. Stone artifacts from Shangqian in China may be older than Dmanisi, and cut-marked bones from Romania have been argued to approach 2 million years in age. These sites lack the combination of complete hominin fossils and secure context that makes Dmanisi so powerful, but they suggest that dispersal could have begun before the Georgian population lived. Dmanisi is therefore not necessarily the first footprint beyond Africa. It is the clearest early body of evidence showing what at least one such population looked like. Their success may have depended on broad ecological tolerance rather than specialized genius. A population able to eat plants, meat, marrow, and seasonal foods could enter unfamiliar habitats more easily than one dependent on a narrow resource. Groups that made tools from local stone were less tied to particular quarries. Individuals that learned from one another could adjust without waiting for anatomical change. Cooperation around carcasses, shared vigilance, and tolerance of vulnerable members may have increased resilience even when technology remained simple. Climate still mattered, but not as a single open gate. Recent work challenges the idea that hominins moved only during warm and humid corridors. Favorable periods may have helped, yet Dmanisi shows occupation under seasonal conditions requiring adjustment. Populations did not simply drift north behind a permanent green pathway. They encountered changing landscapes, colder intervals, new predators, and unfamiliar plant communities. Flexibility allowed them to use opportunities that were temporary and uneven. There is a temptation to describe this as evidence that intelligence mattered more than brain size, but even that claim exceeds what fossils can measure. The Dmanisi hominins clearly solved practical problems. They walked efficiently, selected stone, processed carcasses, and survived in groups. Whether their cognition resembled that of later Homo cannot be known. The safer conclusion is narrower and more important. The threshold for geographic expansion was lower than researchers once assumed. Large brains, Acheulean hand axes, regular fire, and modern body proportions were not all prerequisites. This changes the meaning of the first dispersals. They were not launched by a sudden leap into recognizable humanity. They emerged from ordinary survival repeated across space. No planned expedition stood at the edge of Africa. No inventor handed a population the final technology needed to leave. There were only groups responding to water, food, competition, danger, and opportunity, each movement local enough to make sense. By the time early humans appeared at Dmanisi, the astonishing journey may already have become normal life. The individuals beneath the later fortress were not necessarily pioneers who remembered Africa. They may have belonged to populations established in Western Asia for generations. Their achievement lay not in crossing a line on a map, but in inhabiting a world wider than any confirmed hominin population before them. They did so with tools that looked simple, bodies that remained ancient, and abilities that left almost no direct trace. Dmanisi shows that humanity's first great expansion did not wait for complexity to announce itself. It began when adaptability was already enough. A route from Africa to Dmanisi looks obvious only when drawn after the fact. On a modern map, one can trace the Nile northward, cross the Levant, turn through Anatolia or the southern Caucasus, and arrive at the Georgian uplands. The line is clean. The Pleistocene landscape was not. Rivers shifted, deserts expanded and contracted, mountain passes opened seasonally, and animal communities moved in response. No archaeological chain marks every step. Between the best-known African sites and Dmanisi lies a broad zone where evidence is sparse, buried, eroded, or undiscovered. The most commonly proposed corridor begins in eastern Africa, where early Homo was established before 1.8 million years ago. From there, populations could have moved through the Nile Valley, along the Red Sea margins, or into the Levant through routes that became more or less passable as climate changed. None is securely demonstrated for the Dmanisi population. The fossil record preserves distant points of presence, not a travelling group. A jaw in Georgia cannot identify the valley its ancestors crossed. The Levant remains central because it connects Africa with Western Asia without requiring a sea crossing. River systems, lakes, springs, and patches of grassland could have supported herbivores and the hominins that followed them. During wetter intervals, zones that later became severe barriers may have carried enough water and vegetation to permit movement. Yet recent climatic research cautions against reducing every dispersal to a single warm green window. Hominins may also have moved under cooler or drier conditions, using ecological flexibility rather than waiting for an ideal corridor. A corridor was not necessarily a broad ribbon of abundance. It could have been a broken sequence of usable habitats separated by difficult ground. A river valley might provide food for part of the year and become dangerous during floods. Upland routes could offer fewer large carnivores but harsher winters. Coastal plains might open during lower sea levels and later disappear. Populations could advance, remain isolated, retreat, or die out. The route north was probably a network of temporary opportunities rather than one permanent road. Western Asia may have held populations for generations before any descendants reached Dmanisi. The distance from the Levant to the southern Caucasus is substantial, but not when divided across many lifetimes. Groups could expand through river basins and foothills, learning local stone and seasonal foods. Children born in one valley might never travel farther than neighbouring valleys, while the population gradually shifted its range. By the time hominins occupied Dmanisi, Africa may have been an ancestral origin rather than a remembered homeland. The Caucasus is often imagined as a wall, and in places it is high peaks, snow, steep ravines, and cold seasons can block movement. Dmanisi, however, lies in the southern Caucasus, not beyond the highest crest. The region includes lower passes, plateaus, river corridors, and intermontane basins linking Anatolia, the Levant, the Caspian region, and the Eurasian interior. These routes do not eliminate difficulty, but they turn the mountains from an absolute barrier into a landscape of selective passage. The confluence near Dmanisi concentrated several advantages. Water drew animals, river cobbles supplied stone. Open ground offered visibility, while wooded margins provided cover and plant foods. A group moving through the region did not need to choose Dmanisi as a destination. The place may simply have been one favourable node in a larger web of seasonal movement. Its exceptional fossil record can make it appear biologically unique when it may have been unique mainly in preservation. That possibility has gained weight from discoveries at Orozmani, another early Pleistocene site in the same region. Mode 1 tools, abundant animal fossils, a reported hominin tooth, and a recently announced mandible suggest that early Homo was not confined to one hill beneath the later fortress. The full scientific analysis of the newest jaw remains incomplete, so it cannot settle the identity of the Dmanisi fossils or establish another species. Still, Orozmani hints that hominins were distributed more widely across the southern Caucasus than one site alone could show. If several localities eventually produce comparable remains, the migration story may shift again. Dmanisi could become one preserved window into a regional population network rather than a solitary outpost. Groups may have moved between river systems, following herbivores and returning to productive areas. Some populations may have been connected by occasional contact, while others remained isolated long enough to diverge anatomically. Such a network could help explain why the 5 Dmanisi skulls are so varied, though this remains an inference. Movement northward also depended on what the hominins could carry without leaving durable traces. Stone tools were made locally, but knowledge travelled in bodies and relationships. Individuals had to recognize water, edible plants, dangerous animals, useful stone, and seasonal shelter. They may have learned routes by following older group members or repeatedly exploring familiar margins. No evidence reveals the complexity of their communication. Still, a population cannot occupy a broad landscape without transmitting practical information. Animal movement may have provided the most consistent guide. Herds respond to rain, grass, water, and snow. Hominins exploiting carcasses or hunting opportunities would expand alongside them without consciously following a continental path. Carnivores did the same, which meant every ecological corridor carried competitors as well as food. A landscape rich enough to support migration was also rich enough to support saber-toothed cats, hyenas, wolves, and bears. The routes north were dangerous for the same reason they were productive. The earliest expansion may therefore have resembled a moving frontier with no fixed edge. Some groups entered new basins and disappeared. Others persisted long enough to send descendants farther. Climate repeatedly rearranged the possibilities. Forest could close open ground. Drought could empty a corridor. Volcanic activity could reshape drainage. A population's range might expand during one generation and contract during the next. Archaeology captures only rare moments when stone and bone survived these changes. This is why no single route can be drawn with confidence. The Nile-Levant pathway is plausible, as are connections through Western Asia into the Caucasus, but the missing sites remain too numerous for certainty. There may have been multiple dispersals, overlapping populations, and paths no longer visible above modern coastlines or beneath later sediments. What survives in the record suggests movement was repeated, opportunistic, and ecologically informed. Dmanisi stands at the northern end of that uncertainty. The site proves that early Homo reached the southern Caucasus, but it does not reveal whether the inhabitants arrived recently, descended from older Western Asian populations, or belonged to one of several expansions. Their path is absent, yet their presence is undeniable. The 5 faces do not show a marching column from Africa. They show the outcome of countless local decisions made across generations. Until a population with ancient bodies and simple tools had crossed landscapes, no earlier hominin has left such clear evidence of inhabiting. The route into the southern Caucasus remains uncertain, but the route into the fossil deposits is equally difficult to reconstruct. Dmanisi is often imagined as a camp suddenly buried beneath volcanic earth, a place where 5 individuals and the animals around them were sealed together in one disaster. The real site is far less tidy. Its bones, tools, sediments, and cavities record repeated events layered upon one another. Hominins came and went, carnivores fed, dragged remains, and returned. Animals died naturally. Water shifted objects. Sediment entered cracks and hollows. Over time, separate moments accumulated into a single archaeological surface that appears unified only because nearly 2 million years have compressed the sequence. This kind of deposit is known as a palimpsest, a record written, disturbed, and written over again. At Dmanisi, the word is especially appropriate because the ancient ground contained a complex system of depressions, vertical pipes, narrow channels, and subterranean spaces formed within volcanic and sedimentary layers. Some features may have functioned like traps. Others collected bones that had already been moved from where death occurred. As the cavities filled, objects from different episodes could settle close together. A skull beside another skull does not necessarily mean 2 bodies lay side by side in life or death. The concentration of hominin crania within a restricted area has encouraged dramatic explanations. Perhaps the individuals fell into a natural opening. Perhaps predators brought them there. Perhaps bodies were washed into a cavity. Perhaps the place served repeatedly as a carnivore den or feeding location. Each scenario explains part of the evidence, but none explains everything without difficulty. Scholars still debate the relative roles of geology, carnivore behavior, human activity, gravity, and water, because the final assemblage is the outcome of several processes rather than one. The animal bones make this complexity visible. Some bear cut marks produced by stone tools, others carry tooth marks, crushing, or digestion damage linked to carnivores. Some show both forms of modification, suggesting that hominins and predators accessed the same carcass at different times. A limb may have been cut by humans and later gnawed by a hyena. Another carcass may have been opened first by a large cat, then scavenged by hominins, then broken apart again after burial. The sequence can sometimes be inferred from overlapping marks, but many bones preserve too little information for certainty. Carnivores were not merely background danger, they were active agents in forming the site. Giant hyenas could transport heavy bones, crush shafts, and concentrate remains around feeding areas. Large cats might drag prey into protected spaces. Bears and canids could disturb older accumulations while creating new ones. A location repeatedly used by predators can contain animals killed elsewhere, individuals that died nearby, and bones moved long after flesh disappeared. Dmanisi's extraordinary carnivore community therefore helped create the fossil record that later made the hominins visible. Hominins also altered the deposits. They made tools on site, leaving flakes, cores, and broken stone where napping occurred or where debris was discarded. They processed animals, moved selected body parts, and may have carried food away. A carcass does not enter the archaeological record as a complete animal if useful portions are removed. The bones left behind reflect choices, access, competition, and transport. Yet the same area could later be used by carnivores or covered by sediment. What appears as one activity zone may combine several occupations separated by years or generations. Natural death added another layer. Herbivores living near the rivers could die from injury, disease, age, seasonal stress, or accidents in uneven ground. Small animals might enter cavities and fail to escape. Floodwater could carry lighter bones farther than heavy ones. Gravity could pull objects downslope. Sediment collapse could break or reposition fossils already buried. None of these processes requires a catastrophic event, and together they can produce a dense accumulation without a single moment of mass death. The hominin remains must be interpreted within this mixed system. There is no secure evidence that all 5 individuals died together. Their fossils belong to a relatively narrow geological interval, but that interval still permits considerable time. One individual may have entered the deposits decades, centuries, or longer before another. The sediments do not preserve a shared final scene. They preserve proximity after burial, and proximity after burial can be created by the landscape itself. This distinction also affects the search for causes of death. Tooth marks or damage on an animal bone can sometimes identify predation or scavenging. Hominin skulls, however, do not provide a clear common pattern showing that a saber-toothed cat, giant hyena, fall, flood, or disease killed them all. Some specimens show damage or pathological change, but those traces do not establish one fatal mechanism. The possibility that carnivores consumed or transported human remains is real. So is the possibility that bodies entered cavities through other processes. No single explanation fully accounts for the assemblage. The site's preservation was nevertheless extraordinary. Cranial bones are fragile, and exposed remains are usually scattered, crushed, weathered, or consumed. At Dmanisi, cavities and rapid sediment filling sometimes protected skulls before a complete destruction. Volcanic landscapes can be harsh for the living yet generous to the fossil record. The same unstable ground that trapped, shifted, or collected bones also sealed them away from later erosion. Preservation was not the result of a peaceful burial. It was the accidental outcome of disturbance followed by protection. Researchers reconstruct this history through taphonomy, the study of everything that happens to remains between death and discovery. They examine breakage patterns, surface weathering, tooth marks, cut marks, sediment adhesion, orientation, spatial distribution, and the size of fragments. They compare the assemblage with modern carnivore dens, natural traps, river deposits, and archaeological sites. Each clue narrows possibilities. But taphonomy rarely produces a complete narrative. The same damage can sometimes arise through different processes, and later disturbance can erase the order in which events occurred. This uncertainty does not make Dmanisi less valuable. It prevents the fossils from being forced into a scene the evidence cannot support. The site was not a preserved village floor, not a cemetery, and not a single catastrophe frozen in time. It was a repeatedly used landscape where hominins, herbivores, carnivores, water, and geology interacted. The 5 faces survived because their remains entered that system, not because the system kept their lives intact. Seen this way, Dmanisi becomes more realistic and more mysterious. The fossils do not show 5 companions at the end of one journey. They show 5 individuals drawn from a wider population, gathered by processes that operated long after each life ended. The Earth assembled the group that science later tried to classify. What looks like a portrait may be a geological collection, and the distance between those 2 possibilities is one of the most important cautions the site preserves. When Skull 5 was finally assembled, it did more than add another face to Dmanisi. It changed the scale of the argument. The cranium D4500 recovered in 2005 matched the massive mandible D2600 found 5 years earlier. Together they formed the most complete adult skull known from the early Pleistocene. Completeness made the fossil powerful because it removed much of the freedom that fragmentary remains allow. The brain case, face, palate, teeth, and lower jaw belong to one individual. Features that might otherwise have been assigned to different species were locked together in a single head. The combination was extraordinary. The cranial capacity was only about 546 cubic centimeters, the smallest among the 5 Dmanisi skulls. Yet the face was large, long, and strongly projecting. The jaws were deep and robust. The posterior teeth were large. This was not a delicate face attached to a small brain case. It was one of the most powerfully built faces in the Dmanisi collection attached to its smallest vault. Before D4500 appeared, D2600 had already caused difficulty. The jaw looked so unlike the smaller Dmanisi mandibles that some researchers treated it as evidence for a distinct species, Homo georgicus. Its proportions seemed too extreme to fit comfortably within the same population as the more gracile individuals. For 5 years, its cranium was missing. Once D4500 was recognized as the matching cranium, the jaw no longer stood alone. Its unusual dimensions became part of a complete anatomical system rather than an anomaly. That completeness strengthened 2 opposing interpretations. To the Dmanisi team, Skull 5 demonstrated how dramatically one individual within a single population could differ from others. If such an unusual combination occurred alongside the remaining skulls in the same broad period, then early Homo may have been far more variable than species classification suggested. The fossil warned against naming separate species from isolated jaws and crania from distant sites. Traits that looked taxonomically decisive could coexist within one regional population. To critics, the same fossil suggested the opposite. Skull 5 was not merely a larger version of the smaller faces. Its jaw, teeth, facial proportions, and cranial form differed in structured ways that might exceed ordinary variation. The more complete it became, the harder it was to dismiss those differences as errors of reconstruction. If D2600 and D4500 represented a distinct lineage, then Dmanisi may have preserved more than one kind of early human in the same landscape. The argument therefore turned on a difficult question: what level of difference is expected within one species when the species itself is extinct and poorly sampled? Modern humans offer one comparison, living apes another, but neither provides a perfect model for early Homo. Sexual dimorphism may account for some contrast between robust and gracile individuals. Age and body size also matter, yet the sex of Skull 5 is not known with certainty, and calling it male because it is large risks building the conclusion into the evidence. The fossil cannot be reduced safely to a simple male-female distinction. Pathology further complicates the picture. Skull 5 shows changes around parts of the face and jaw that may reflect injury, disease, or long-term stress. Such alterations can modify bone shape and exaggerate differences from healthier individuals. Heavy chewing and dental wear also influence the skeleton over time. A face is not formed by genes alone. It is remodeled through growth, diet, muscle use, trauma, and age. Still, pathology cannot explain every unusual feature, and no single explanation fully accounts for the whole combination. The fossil also challenged assumptions about evolutionary sequence. A very small brain case might be expected to accompany a generally primitive, lightly built skull. A massive face and jaw might be associated with another anatomical grade. Skull 5 joined these expectations incorrectly, from the perspective of older models. It showed that evolution did not alter every part of the head in harmony. Brain size, facial reduction, dental proportions, and cranial architecture could change at different rates. The result was a mosaic individual that did not fit neatly between Homo habilis and later Homo erectus. This mosaic quality made Skull 5 important beyond Dmanisi. Researchers compared it with African fossils assigned to Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Homo ergaster, as well as Asian Homo erectus. Depending on which features were emphasized, the skull could appear close to more than one group. The Dmanisi team argued that the variation among the 5 skulls resembled the range separating several named African species. If one local population could contain comparable diversity, perhaps the African record had been divided too finely. Opponents replied that geographic and chronological association alone does not prove biological unity. 2 related species can occupy the same region, use similar tools, and enter the same deposits. Closely spaced fossils are not automatically members of one breeding population. The formation of Dmanisi as a palimpsest makes that caution even more important. Skull 5 and the other individuals need not have lived simultaneously, and the deposits may span enough time for different populations to appear. The 2025 dental study renewed this challenge by identifying 2 clusters among the Dmanisi teeth. Because Skull 5 carries the most distinctive mandible and dental pattern, it became central once again. The authors argued that one group retained more primitive characteristics, and that the differences were not easily explained by sexual dimorphism alone. Their proposal revived Homo georgicus and introduced Homo caucasi for part of the material. Yet the sample was small. Associations between loose teeth and skulls were incomplete, and the new names were not widely accepted as settled taxonomy. Skull 5 therefore remains both evidence and obstacle. It is evidence because its completeness proves that a tiny brain case and enormous face belong to one adult. It is an obstacle because that same completeness refuses to reveal whether the individual was an extreme member of one variable population or representative of another lineage. The fossil narrows some uncertainties while deepening the central one. Its public image can also mislead. Because Skull 5 is so complete and visually dramatic, reconstructions often use it as the face of Dmanisi. But the other 4 skulls are not reduced versions of it. They differ in size, delicacy, age, dental condition, and cranial proportions. Making Skull 5 the standard appearance of the population erases the variation that gives the site importance. What the fossil ultimately changed was not one species' name, but the confidence with which species could be named. It forced researchers to confront the possibility that early human anatomy was distributed in combinations no simple ladder predicted. Skull 5 did not settle whether Dmanisi held one species or several. It made both possibilities harder to dismiss. In the smallest brain case and largest face at the site, the argument became complete enough to see clearly and still impossible to finish. After Skull 5, the argument turns outward again, because Dmanisi is not only a collection of unusual faces, it is also a gap in a much larger map. If hominins reached the southern Caucasus by roughly 1.8 million years ago, then other populations must have occupied parts of Western Asia. Yet the fossil record beyond Dmanisi remains astonishingly thin. Stone tools appear at scattered early sites, animal bones sometimes carry cut marks, and isolated human remains emerge only rarely. The landscape suggests movement. The bodies themselves almost disappear. This scarcity can create the illusion that Dmanisi was a single failed excursion, a small population stranded far from Africa and then erased. That is possible, but it is not the only explanation. Fossilization is uncommon. human populations were likely small, mobile, and widely dispersed. Their bodies were exposed to carnivores, weather, water, trampling, erosion, and geological destruction. Even when bones entered sediment, later rivers could remove them. Mountains could fracture them, and ancient surfaces could vanish beneath modern towns. The absence of fossils may record poor preservation more clearly than human absence. Early archaeological sites are also difficult to recognize. Mode 1 tools can resemble naturally broken stone, especially without clear occupation surfaces or human fossils. A small scatter of flakes may be disturbed, redeposited, or buried beyond reach. Dating such deposits requires volcanic layers, magnetic reversals, faunal comparison, or other evidence strong enough to survive debate. Dmanisi is exceptional not because early Eurasian history necessarily began there, but because geology, archaeology, and preservation aligned unusually well. Other sites hint at a wider dispersal. At Shangchen in China, stone artifacts have been dated as far back as about 2.12 million years, though no hominin bones accompany them. At Grounșianu in Romania, cut-marked animal bones have been interpreted as evidence of hominin activity around 1.95 million years ago. These claims suggest that people may have moved across Eurasia before the famous Dmanisi fossils accumulated, yet both cases are debated. Tools without makers and marks without bodies can extend a route, but they cannot reveal the anatomy or identity of those who travelled it. Farther east, later fossils assigned broadly to Homo erectus appear in China and Indonesia. Their skulls often differ from the Dmanisi sample in brain size, cranial thickness, vault shape, and facial proportions. The intervening record is too incomplete to prove direct ancestry. Dmanisi may lie near the source of later Asian Homo erectus populations, but it may also represent a sister population, a regional branch, or an early expansion that contributed little to later groups. Similarity does not establish descent, and age alone cannot make one population the ancestor of another. The same uncertainty applies to Africa. Dmanisi shares traits with fossils often assigned to Homo habilis and Homo ergaster, but the route from those populations into Western Asia remains fragmentary. There may have been repeated departures rather than a single wave. One population could have expanded through the Levant and disappeared. Another could have followed later. Different groups might have mixed, replaced one another, or occupied neighbouring ecological zones. The 5 faces could represent diversity within one expansion, diversity produced after isolation, or the meeting of lineages whose earlier movements are no longer visible. Climate would have repeatedly opened and closed possibilities. Grasslands expanded, woodlands shifted, lakes appeared and contracted, and cold or dry phases altered animal distributions. A population thriving in one corridor could be cut off when vegetation changed. They did not need one dramatic catastrophe to vanish. Poor seasons, reduced prey, competition, disease, or reproductive isolation could shrink a population until no descendants remained. Extinction at this scale may leave no final layer, only silence. Yet disappearance from one region does not mean failure everywhere. Populations could move on before conditions worsened. Descendants of Dmanisi-like hominins may have spread eastward, southward, or back toward favourable habitats. If they survived, their anatomy could have changed through time, making later fossils look different enough to obscure the connection. Evolution does not preserve a family resemblance unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years. Orozmani strengthens the possibility that early Homo occupied a broader southern Caucasian landscape, rather than one isolated hill. its tools, fauna, reported tooth, and announced jaw suggest regional presence around 1.8 million years ago. But the newer remains still require full scientific description before they can settle taxonomy or ancestry. They cannot yet identify a sixth Dmanisi face or confirm that one species dominated the region. They provide spatial context. The world around Dmanisi may have held more hominins than the famous site alone reveals. The lack of ancient DNA deepens the uncertainty. At this age, genetic material is unlikely to survive in readable form, and no Dmanisi hominin genome has been recovered. Ancient proteins may endure longer, as shown by enamel proteins from a Dmanisi rhinoceros, but that success does not identify the human fossils. Without genetic evidence, relationships must be inferred from anatomy, development, tools, and geography. None can trace a continuous lineage across Eurasia. Even the 2026 proteomic work on Asian Homo erectus does not resolve Dmanisi directly. Those data come from other fossils and clarify parts of the wider Homo story, not the identity of the 5 Georgian skulls. It would be tempting to use a new molecular method as a final answer, but the Dmanisi individuals remain beyond its direct reach. Their place in later human ancestry is still reconstructed from bones alone. This uncertainty changes the meaning of disappearance. The Dmanisi hominins may have died out locally, merged into other populations, moved beyond the region, or contributed ancestry to groups whose fossils look different. More than one outcome could have occurred. A population can vanish as a recognizable form, while some descendants continue elsewhere. It can also persist biologically while disappearing archaeologically if later sites remain undiscovered. What survives is therefore not a complete migration but a brief opening. For a narrow interval, geology preserves faces, jaws, limbs, tools, and animal remains with unusual clarity. Before that opening, roots are mostly inferred. After it, the bodies thin again. Dmanisi stands like a lit room in a dark corridor, bright enough to show that early humans had reached Eurasia, but not bright enough to reveal where every doorway led. The pioneers may have endured for generations, perhaps far longer than the deposit's record. They may have expanded across landscapes now submerged, eroded, or buried. They may also have disappeared without descendants, one of many human experiments that left no living legacy. No single explanation fully accounts for the silence after Dmanisi. The 5 faces prove presence, not destiny. Their greatest legacy may be the realization that a major human dispersal could occur, spread widely, and almost vanish from the fossil record, leaving one extraordinary site to carry the weight of an entire missing world. The silence after Dmanisi does not diminish what the site has already changed. 5 skulls, several jaws, more than 100 postcranial remains, thousands of stone artifacts, and a dense community of extinct animals have forced the first expansion beyond Africa to be imagined differently. The people preserved beneath the medieval ruins were not tall, large-brained travellers carrying refined hand axes into an empty continent. They were variable in size and appearance, equipped mainly with Mode 1 technology, living among giant hyenas and saber-toothed cats, and adapting to a seasonal environment without secure evidence of controlled fire. Their presence makes early humanity look less like a sequence of completed advances and more like a set of unfinished capacities already sufficient for movement. The 5 faces are central because they resist becoming one face. Skull 1 is relatively robust. Skull 2 is smaller and more lightly built. Skull 3 preserves an individual still developing. Skull 4 carries the long remodeling produced by severe tooth loss. Skull 5 joins a tiny brain case to an enormous face and mandible. Their contrast cannot be reduced safely to one explanation. Age accounts for part of the difference. Pathology and dental history account for more. Body size and possible sexual dimorphism may widen the range. Yet the possibility of more than one taxon remains open, especially after the 2025 dental study identified 2 morphological groupings within the sample. That study did not settle the matter, and its uncertainty is important. A small number of teeth cannot by itself transform a disputed name into accepted biological reality. Not every specimen can be securely matched to a skull, and dental dimensions vary within populations. Still, the result prevents the one species interpretation from becoming automatic. Dmanisi may preserve one highly variable early Homo population, 2 related lineages sharing the same region, or a sequence of populations entering the landscape at different times. The site gives science enough evidence to sharpen the question, but not enough to close it. The younger individual adds another kind of variation. Microscopic study of dental growth published in 2024 suggests a childhood that combined rapid development, resembling great apes with delayed rear tooth formation, and a later growth pulse that appears more human-like. The pattern is neither modern nor simply primitive. It suggests that changes in life history emerged piece by piece, before the large brains and prolonged development of Homo sapiens. Childhood itself was evolving as a mosaic, just as the skull and skeleton were mosaics. The Dmanisi population therefore carried not only mixed anatomy, but a developmental schedule in transition. The bodies below the neck tell the same story. Long lower limbs, stable knees and ankles, aligned big toes, and arched feet supported effective bipedal travel. Longer arms and more primitive upper body proportions show that this mobility did not require a fully modern frame. Their bodies were capable without being finished according to any later human standard. That distinction matters because evolution has no final design waiting to be completed. A population survives through the total effect of its traits, not by matching a future species. Their social world remains harder to see, but it cannot be dismissed. The toothless individual lived long after the jaw had remodeled, surviving a condition that sharply restricted normal chewing. Soft foods, marrow, stone-cut meat, and personal adaptation may explain part of that endurance. Assistance from others is also plausible. The fossil does not prove compassion, kinship, or organized caregiving, yet it shows that profound dental impairment did not immediately exclude one individual from survival. In a landscape of seasonal scarcity and dangerous carnivores, that fact points towards social tolerance and resilience, even if the precise form of support is lost. Their tools reveal another form of resilience. Mode 1 technology could be reproduced from local stone wherever suitable cobbles appeared. Its strength was not visual complexity but portability of knowledge. A core, a hammerstone, and an understanding of fracture could create cutting edges quickly. This allowed hominins to enter new valleys without carrying an elaborate technological system. They could adapt existing skills to local material. The first spread into Eurasia may have depended less on a revolutionary invention than on behaviors flexible enough to function in many landscapes. This does not mean movement was easy or inevitable. Most dispersals may have failed. Groups could enter new territory and disappear during a harsh season, lose access to water, or become isolated below a viable population size. Dmanisi preserves success only in the narrow sense that hominins reached the region and remained long enough to leave repeated archaeological traces. Whether their descendants continued eastward, merged with later populations, or vanished entirely remains unknown. The site proves mobility, not triumph. It also reveals how misleading the phrase "first out of Africa" can be. Dmanisi is the strongest early body fossil evidence beyond Africa, but possible older tools and cut-marked bones elsewhere suggest earlier movements. There may never have been a single first departure. Populations probably expanded, retreated, fragmented, and expanded again. What appears from the distance of 2 million years as one migration may have been thousands of small adjustments to water, vegetation, prey, rivals, and season. Nearby Orozmani now hints that this presence extended beyond one fossil trap. Its Mode 1 artifacts, animal remains, reported tooth, and newly announced mandible suggest that early hominins occupied a broader southern Caucasian region. Yet the new jaw still awaits the level of detailed, peer-reviewed description required to determine its identity. It cannot be used as a sixth Dmanisi face or as proof of another species. Nor can molecular evidence rescue the classification for now. No hominin DNA or protein sequence has been recovered from the 5 individuals. Their relationships must still be read from anatomy, growth, geological context, and the imperfect comparisons available elsewhere. The legacy of Dmanisi therefore lies not in providing one ancestor with a secure name. It lies in changing the questions asked of every early Homo fossil. How much variation can one population contain? Which traits were truly necessary for dispersal? How slowly did childhood, brain organization, and body form become human-like? How often did populations leave Africa without leaving descendants? How many species names reflect biological boundaries, and how many reflect the accidents of discovery? 5 faces cannot answer all of these questions, but they prevent older assumptions from returning unchanged. They show that early humans were mobile before they were modern, socially resilient before there is evidence for complex culture, and anatomically diverse before the human record becomes abundant enough to explain that diversity. Dmanisi does not simplify human evolution. It makes the story more realistic, branching, overlapping, adaptive, and incomplete. And so the ridge remains above the 2 rivers, holding several histories at once. Medieval walls catch the afternoon light. Grass moves through broken foundations. Beneath them, darker sediments keep the traces of a world with no cities, no written names, and no memory that could survive in words. The 5 individuals did not know they were early, and they did not know they had crossed a boundary between continents. They searched for water, stone, food, shelter, and one another. Their lives were immediate, measured in weather, hunger, distance, and the movements of animals across the valley. The great journey exists only in hindsight, assembled from bones that entered the earth by different paths. Perhaps some of their descendants moved farther east. Perhaps their lineage ended in the Caucasus. Perhaps they became part of populations whose later faces no longer resembled them. Time has removed the answer, as it removes most answers from lives that leave no language behind. What remains is small a flake struck from a cobble, a jaw reshaped after years without teeth, a young individual's growth written inside enamel, a massive face surrounding a remarkably small brain. These are not monuments, but they have endured longer than kingdoms built above them. Dmanisi reminds us that survival does not always belong to the most complete, the most powerful, or the most familiar. Sometimes it belongs to bodies still in transition, to knowledge carried without writing, and to groups able to move without understanding the scale of their movement. yet survival is never guaranteed. A population can cross a continent and still disappear so thoroughly that only 5 faces remain. Their silence is part of the lesson. Nearly every person who ever lived before writing has vanished without a name, and most left no recognizable bone. The record is not a continuous memory of humanity. It is a handful of survivals separated by darkness. Each fossil illuminates a little, while reminding us how much movement, care, fear, and endurance passed beyond recovery. The gaps are not empty, they are simply beyond the reach of evidence. As evening settles over the ridge, the rivers continue below, following channels that have changed countless times. The fortress fades into shadow, the ancient layers stay hidden, and beneath the quiet ground, the 5 faces remain together only now, gathered by geology and discovered by strangers, looking out from a vanished world that carried humanity farther than anyone once believed it could go.